Good afternoon and good morning and good evening to all. I understand that we have over 180 or so participants who are joining us from all over the world. And thank you so much for taking your time and for honoring our invite to join us for the ISDC hosted site event as part of the FAO Science and Innovation Forum. Pierre, can you help me then with the slides? Thank you very much. Good afternoon once more. I am Nompumelelo Oboko. I'm serving as the Vice Chair for the ISDC, which is the Independent Science for Development Council. And I'm also the CEO of the South African Council for Natural Scientific Professions here in South Africa. And the next slide, I'll be really looking at strengthening institutional innovation. A very warm welcome from us as the ISDC, and would like to welcome you to this session, which we hope will be insightful based on the presentations that we're going to have, as well as the interactions through the panel discussion. The ISDC, which is the Independent Science for Development Council, is a standing panel of impartial, world-class scientists appointed by the CGIAR System Council in order to provide independent strategic advice on matters that concerns the CGIAR, as well as the innovation and agriculture landscape. And under the leadership of Professor Holger Menke, who is the ISDC chair, we have so far 7 ISDC members who are representing various geographical regions. The next slide. So in terms of a brief background, just an introduction to this topic, what we're looking at is that accelerating transformation of food, land, and water systems under climate crisis requires institutional innovations. The quality of research for development, which we term QoR4D, the framework developed by the ISDC, facilitates a system-wide CGIAR agreement on what constitutes quality for problem-oriented research designed to have impact. And over the years, experience has demonstrated that the research for development criteria should extend beyond the conventional research output or impact metrics. For example, peer-reviewed publications and their citations. However, it should include, as part of the criteria, relevance, scientific credibility, legitimacy, which also includes local acceptance, and importantly, effectiveness that talks to positioning for use. The quality of research for development, the framework itself, was co-designed using a consultative process, and this involved representatives from entities across the CGIAR who are leading and accessing research quality. So these side events will really help us to take a deep dive into how then can we use the quality of research for development to strengthen different levels of institutional innovations as it supports good governance in CGIAR and agricultural research for development organizations throughout the world. The next slide. So in terms of the agenda and how we are going to progress going forward, I am joined by various experts who have been using and working on the quality of research framework and the tools over the years. Gillian Lin, who is a consultant with the Independent Advisory and Evaluation Services at the CGIAR, will take us through the evaluating quality of research, really why, how, who, and when. And then from then, Professor Andrew Ash, who is an ISDC member and also a professor from Australia, will then look at the framework itself and also its application. And then from then on, we have the ISDC chair, Holger Menke, who will then look at the quality of research to impact and focusing really at the innovation challenge. And then from then onwards, my apologies, We'll have a panel discussion with the speakers, and I'll moderate this session. And joining me then to open up and have the remarks that will help us engage further on this topic will be Mark Schutz, who is a strategic advisor and senior innovation and scaling scientist at the CGIAR. And currently he's in Rwanda. So he's joining us from Rwanda. The next slide. So please allow me at this point to also indicate that this side event that is taking place at the margins of the FAO Science and Innovation Forum 2022, focusing on the quality of research for development to strengthen institutional innovation, is part of a series of the 2022 ISDC Science Forum. So we'll be having next month another session, which is the ISDC Symposium at the TropEC Conference, where we'll be looking at building inclusive innovation in international development. And this will take place on the 1st of November, 2022, just next month in Brisbane, Australia. And we kindly request that you join us and be part of this discourse that will really shape and foster inclusive and institutional innovation. And all the work that has been produced and developed by the ISDC can be found on the website below, and also some of the dates and the times for all the other events that we're going to have going forward. So thank you so much. And we'll then move on to the next presentation, which will be by Gillian Lin, to look at the evaluating quality of research, the why, how, who, and when. Over to you, Jill. Thank you.
Okay, hello, and could I have the first slide, please, Pierre? Thank you. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to explore the why, how, when, and who of evaluating quality of research in the context of the CG Quality of Research for Development framework. I could have the next slide, please, Pierre. The why, I think, can be summarized in 4 words: accountability, transparency, confidence, and contribution. All of these are important. So it's necessary to provide accountability for investment in research that is going to produce international public goods. It's also important to transparently inform donors about the quality of the research and that their investments are sound. Generating confidence in the outputs for next users and policymakers helps to ensure that they will be taken up, and providing evidence about how the CG contributes to its goals, and also the wider contribution to accelerate the progress to system development goals. Next slide, please. So the Quality of Research for Development framework involves or includes 4 elements to evaluate quality of research. These are relevance, scientific credibility, legitimacy, and effectiveness. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus more on scientific credibility and legitimacy. And my colleague, Andrew Ash, who will do the next presentation, he will look more at relevance and effectiveness. Next slide, please. I'd like to highlight that the framework is adaptable, flexible, and broadly applicable. Since its conception, the evaluation framework has evolved through lesson learning and adaptation after various reviews and exercises to changing needs and CG strategy. But this is not dissimilar to other frameworks such as IDRC and the UK REF have also done this. The framework is inherently flexible. It can be applied to all phases of the research and development cycle. And the current version's been informed by both research, by the IDRC framework, and also, by the UK REF framework, and also on development from the IRDC RQ Plus assessment instrument, which means that it has broad application to research development and to research for development operations. Next slide, please. So I said I'm going to focus on scientific credibility and legitimacy. And scientific credibility requires that the research findings be robust and sources of knowledge dependable and sound. And this includes clear demonstration that the data are accurate, the methods used are fit for purpose, and the findings can be clearly presented and logically interpreted. Legitimacy refers more to the research process in terms of its fairness and its ethics, and that others perceive it as such. So it involves the consideration of the interests and perspectives of the intended end users. And it's very important in terms of transparency with respect to the potential conflicts of interest and genuine involvement of partners in co-design and recognition of their contribution. And together, scientific credibility and legitimacy make up the quality of science criterion in the quality of research for development framework. Next slide, please. It's important to operate the framework under 4 dimensions, and these are design, research design, inputs, outputs, and processes. And this allows evaluators to produce a more comprehensive evaluation. Next slide, please. So let's look at the methods. How do we evaluate quality of research? Because the CG is a research for development organization, it uses a mixed methods approach. So the quantitative and qualitative indicators are used in order to produce a credible, balanced, and comprehensive outcome. There are many different quantitative and qualitative methods, and I'm just going to mention a few. In the case of publications, we're interested in bibliometrics and altmetrics, and then other outputs, technical outputs, etc. Then we'll look at numbers, and these can be methods, tools, workshops, reports, policy briefs, databases and other digital outputs, and communication outputs. For qualitative methods, these include looking at the standards, looking at the disciplinary skill base, research infrastructure, and the important is the assessment of partnerships in terms of diversity, ethical considerations. We're also looking at review systems, capacity development, scaling readiness, gender and social inclusion, adequacy of funding, and contribution to the IPGs and the SDGs. Next slide, please. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to look at a couple of examples. This is an example from the use of bibliometrics for evaluating publications, and it was an analysis that was done of the 12 CGCRPs, looking at the output of publications from 2017 to 2021, of which there were almost 5,000. And as you can see in the top part of the table on the left-hand side, we looked at the number of multi-authored publications, and the publications were overwhelmingly multi-authored, which indicates that partnership was of high priority. The diagram on the right-hand side looks at the country collaboration network of just one CRP and involves over 50 countries, again, showing the importance of partnerships. Now, this is good, but what we wanted to do was to look in more detail. Have the next slide, please, Pierre, was to look in more detail at some of these bibliometrics to see if it was possible to identify more innovative bibliometrics. And this work was done by Science Metrics in collaboration with us. And the idea was to delve into existing bibliometrics and to identify others. And I'll look just at authorship. In the case of authorship, they identified other bibliometrics such as gender balance in authorship, North-South collaboration, links with policymakers and NGOs, multidisciplinarity, and thematic alignment with the SDGs, just to name a few. And I can refer you to this publication, and Annex 4 will give all the details. Next slide, please. Looking at qualitative methods, and these are aligned with the various dimensions of the framework. In the blue cells, I've highlighted those indicators that I consider to be more important in terms of evaluating scientific credibility, and in the yellow cells, those that are more important in evaluating legitimacy. So in the case of design, we look at coherence, clarity, integrity, and fitness. In the case of inputs, for the skill base, it would look at the disciplinary mix. In the composition of teams, diversity, where gender is very important. For legitimacy, partnerships, as I said, are very important. We would look at inclusiveness and recognition. And for gender, awareness and responsiveness. Could I have the next slide, please, Pierre? So let's look at, in a bit more detail, legitimacy and partnerships and local acceptance. It's very important to see that understanding local knowledge and culture is incorporated into the design of projects. And this would include gender awareness and social inclusion. We would look to see whether the participatory processes were sound, because these build trust and acceptance at local level. And if this is the case, then contextually appropriate solutions and better outcomes are likely. And I draw your attention to a current discussion on the FAO AR4D website, which is specifically on cultural issues in the context of local acceptance. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so one of the objections that's often made of qualitative methods is that they are subjective. But if you build into the evaluation questions, the use of rubrics, that is standards for performance or production of outputs, then you can reduce to some extent the level of subjectivity. And this is just an example for gender, where you would have two questions, whether gender is included, whether gender is evaluated. And in the case of a gender blind project, then gender considerations were not included or evaluated. In the case of a gender friendly project, then obviously gender would be fully considered in all aspects of research, and there would be rigorous analysis of data, and the data would be fully disaggregated. Next slide, please, Pierre. So we move on to what are the steps involved in evaluating quality of research, quality of science through the framework. There are 6 steps. The first is the scoping study, preparing for the evaluation. Step 2 would be identifying the key evaluation questions and the sub-questions. Then you would map the methods to the evaluation questions. So you'd be looking at qualitative and quantitative methods, whether the evaluation questions required one or the other or both. Next step would be to identify the key documents and the potential gaps. And these are very important, because if you can't gather the information you need from the documents, then you need to look at things like site visits, key informant interviews, and focus group discussions. Then you can collect and analyze all the data. And finally is the important step of triangulation, which provides clear, fuller data and helps confirm results. And this helps to support high quality science specific conclusions and enhances the credibility of the recommendations. Next slide, please. So now we move on to the when. As I said before, the flexibility of the framework allows use of it for all stages of all phases of the project cycle. So at proposal level, through implementation, to a final evaluation or at the end of the initiative or the project. For the proposal phase, you'd be looking at things like design inputs and processes. During the implementation phases, you would be looking at inputs, processes, and outputs, and particularly with a view for midterm corrections. Then at the end of the initiative or the project, you'd be looking at effectiveness, particularly issues such as output to outcome studies and outcome to impact case studies. And then 3 to 5 years after the end of the project or the initiative, Again, effectiveness is important, and you'll be looking at outcomes and impacts. I think this is the last slide, please, Pierre. So then who would benefit from having a research for development framework? Clearly the CG and the independent evaluators would use it. But at the same time, all members of the institutes, the scientists, the managers, and the governance would also benefit. Scientists need to be aware of the framework and the sorts of things that would be evaluated. Managers need to be able to provide guidance and to be able to make sure that the processes involved in research are fair and ethical. Governance would provide oversight, and also support and advice, whereas the funders will want to know that their investments are sound. But the framework also has potential use beyond the CG. Research and development partners that work with CG, they do other work as well, and it's quite possible that the framework could be useful for them in work that is not in partnership with the CG. Other research and development organizations that manage a portfolio of projects, then other research and other development organizations, they can pick and choose what is relevant from the framework for their particular work. So the framework, in summary, the framework's flexible. There's no one size fits all. Appropriate indicators will depend on the context. And when these are selected and categorized under the 4 elements, then they will serve as a powerful mechanism for ensuring the highest standards of agricultural research and development. So that's my presentation. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jill. I suggest we move directly to the next presenter in order to keep our timeline. So Andrew, when you want, thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. And if you can bring up the presentation, Pierre, when you get to that. So thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone who's attending this webinar. So following on from Jill, I will look at the application of the QoR4D framework, concentrating more in the areas of relevance and effectiveness. But I will also provide a bit more context on the development of the framework. So Pierre, next slide. So the QoR4D was originally developed in 2017 and adopted by the CG system in 2018, and then revised again in 2020 when the ISDC was formed from the previous ISPC. And the framework was designed to help developing research strategies and programs around establishing a new research portfolio, particularly in the context of the reform agenda within the CG, for monitoring and evaluation systems, as Jill has just outlined, and in designing performance management standards. The 4 key elements of the framework, which Jill introduced at the start of her talk, around relevance and legitimacy, scientific credibility and effectiveness. I'm going to go through 2 examples of applying that, one in the context of the CG research programs, and the second in the more recent implementation of initiatives across the CG system. So next slide. So the 4 elements there, I won't touch on those anymore in terms of legitimacy and scientific credibility, but I will just go into a bit more detail around relevance and effectiveness. So next slide, please. Yeah. So relevance refers to the importance, significance and usefulness of the research objectives, process and findings to the problem context and to society, associated with CG's comparative advantage to address the problem. So it's very much aligning the research to what the problems are and the needs are within different regions of the area and domain that CG operates in. Next slide, please. And effectiveness is very much relates to the positioning of that research for use. So very much trying to get to the point where that research is delivering not just outputs, but outcomes and ultimately impacts. So it's generating knowledge that can be used to contribute to a problem and contribute to innovations and solutions. And that requires that it's designed with an appropriate theory of change, the right aspects of leadership and capacity development, the diversity of the skills, and the ability to translate that research into desired outcomes. So that means having a clear path to impact in one of or more of the 5 CGIAR impact areas. So next slide, please, Pierre. So we have been doing some testing of the framework over the last couple of years, as I mentioned. Within the CG system, we tested the views of science leaders and their perceptions, and there was a very strong affirmation that the QoR4D framework should be part of the one CGIAR agenda, with 88% of the science leaders expressing positive opinions around the usefulness and application of the framework. Next slide, please. Yeah, and in terms of actually which of those 4 elements of the framework have been applied and easiest to mainstream into planning and management practice by science leaders within the CG, 42% were very much around the relevance side, and scientific credibility 23%, with less sort of at that stage application in the areas of effectiveness and legitimacy. Next slide, please. Yeah. So in terms of operating the elements through the CRP evaluations, the CG research program evaluations, and as Jill said, there were 12 of those CRPs were evaluated in 2020. And I won't spend too much time on this, but this covers areas of just reaffirms what Jill was saying around scientific credibility and legitimacy in terms of coming up with the appropriate metrics, both quantitative and qualitative, to assess that quality of science in the context of credibility and legitimacy. And these are just some of the outputs from the CRP evaluation in terms of around some of the bibliometrics. We move on now, because I'll focus more on the areas of effectiveness. So in reviewing the CRPs, there was an assessment of what outputs and outcomes have been achieved and what isn't, the importance of the results. So across those 12 CRPs that were reviewed, milestones at that point in the review process of the CRPs, there was an accomplishment of 50 to 90%, and contributing to intermediate development outcomes. Some challenges raised in terms of funding structure and its impact on the effectiveness of some of the research programs, but overall well managed with timely reporting across the CRPs. Some of the examples of those intermediate development outcomes that were delivered are in that right-hand box there, around closed yield gaps, enhanced genetic gain, increased resilience of agro ecosystems and communities. So they're just some examples of those intermediate development outcomes, and there were many more. Next slide, please, Pierre. Another side of effectiveness is in terms of innovations, and in this slide, which contains a fair bit of information, but we'll just concentrate in those 3 boxes on the right, where there's some examples of innovations. The first box there around digital and sort of the technology style innovations, and there's examples there around CCAFs and weather and climate information systems. Another example there from Ethiopia. Innovations in terms of management frameworks and system strengthening, and that really highlights that innovations are way more than just the technologies. And there's some examples there given for Ethiopia and Bangladesh. And lastly, there in genetics, breeding and improved varieties, the ongoing, and it's been a long term strength of the CG system in providing improved sort of varieties, particularly in maize, rice and wheat for many parts of the world. And that in the CRP evaluations, that strength in those innovations continues to be demonstrated. Next slide, please, Pierre. So finally, in the CRP evaluations, other areas of effectiveness that were evaluated, including partnerships, and Jill touched on that in terms of the way the authors came into the multi-author papers, but it also is important in terms of the modalities of how those partnerships operated in undertaking and delivering that research, and how you get added value from bringing different diverse skills together from the different partners. Just a comment there around that some of those partnerships were subject to volatility. There's also around governance and management, effectiveness was assessed in terms of helping translating research into impact. And for those CRPs, the role of the independent steering committees were demonstrated to be positive in supporting the delivery and effectiveness of those CRPs. And finally, on theory of change, which take a fairly prominent setting within the new initiatives within the CG system, they were useful within the CRPs, useful for planning and regularly reviewed, but weren't used for management, and looking to overcome that sort of deficiency within the new initiatives. So we'll move on to the next slide, Pierre. So the second area that we have been applying the QoR4D in the last couple of years is around the proposal assessment, or the initiatives, that the 33 initiatives that have been developed over the last 18 months or so within the CG system. So we started off by trying to develop criteria that addressed all 4 elements of the QoR4D framework, and developing those criteria that were able to capture and anticipate outcomes and impacts. And also we had to ensure that the criteria should be well aligned with the proposal template that the initiative design teams were required to use in pulling their proposals together. And we also developed a scoring system, and should acknowledge that we drew on a lot of work prior to the QoR4D framework from Brian Belcher in putting together the framework and criteria, and also a scoring system. And those criteria should closely link to later evaluation of the projects. So next slide, please. The 17 criteria that we developed are listed there, illustrated in a honeycomb sort of arrangement to indicate that there were overlaps and linkages between many of these criteria. And we're aware that there's some of these overlaps going into the process, and we are looking at how we might modify this in the future. I won't go through those 17 criteria. These slides will be available after this forum, so they can be looked at in more detail then. So next slide, please. So the initiatives, the 33 initiative proposals, they had a very significant investment there of $1.3 billion. So there was a rigorous independent review process undertaken. So the proposals were sent to reviewers. There were 3 reviewers for each proposal initiative, and there was ISCC members who took an active role in working with those review teams. And they were a very diverse mix of reviewers from around the world, and trying to get as much diversity and gender equity as we could in that review process. The the 17 criteria were put together in a template for the reviewers to assess the initiatives against the proposals that they were sent. So next slide, please. So just some of the lessons that were learnt from that process, and it was a very involved process, and the reviews have subsequently gone to the design teams and to the CG leadership, and from what evidence we've seen in subsequent to receiving those comments, the initiative design teams are now building in and revising their initiatives on the basis of the reviews that have come in and the comments from the review teams and the ISDC. So just some of the lessons learnt from applying the QoR4D across both the CRPs and the initiative proposals. So in credibility, there's stronger emphasis on development outcomes and pathways to impact in the proposal design. That had some trade-offs in that they're proactively trying to move more in that direction. There was less sort of attention to some of the underpinning best practice in presenting the scientific research. Some of that relates to the actual template design. But future initiative proposal processes should put more emphasis on identifying knowledge gaps that inhibit development, followed by a more logical sequence of the research questions and their underlying hypotheses. So there's lessons there around getting that right balance between the intended outcomes of the research and supported by the underpinning research questions and hypotheses. So next slide, please. And in terms of relevance, clear evidence of extensive consultation and that created a dynamic portfolio that resonated with the funders, the implementers, and the beneficiaries across the system. That said, that was difficult to determine some of the depth of the partnerships in the co-design and the leverage that was occurring. And also sort of more solid scientific justification outlining why the research is needed, which relates to some of the comments I made from the previous slide. So moving on, Pierre, I think we're close to the end here. In terms of effectiveness, for the first time in CG's history, the entire research portfolio is built to deliver on a single overarching research strategy that was being put together in the last 18 months or so, with each initiative purposely designed to fill knowledge gaps. Now that said, some of the combination of the COVID pandemic and the timing of a lot going on in the reform process, that it was impossible for all the initiatives to completely interact with each other. So there was, as you might expect, some divergent drivers and some contradictory solutions proposed within the different initiatives. And the other main point to raise here is comparative advantage was used inconsistently, and we'll now put a major emphasis within the ISCC and a work stream around trying to more effectively and rigorously apply comparative advantage moving forward. And Pierre, next slide. I think that's pretty much at the end. Yeah, so thanks. So that really just gives an overview of how we've been applying the QoR4D in the context of those CRP evaluations and the initiative process. And I'll end up there. Thanks, Pierre.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Maybe as for Jill, we can go back to the question during the discussion. So for all the participants, please feel free to continue populating the Q&A section, and we will address the question during the discussion. So Holger, if you want to start your presentation, thank you very much.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can, Holger.
Excellent. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And particularly thank you to the organizers for this opportunity to exchange some ideas with you. And thank you to Jill and Andrew for setting the scene. I want to continue on that theme of quality research for development, but I want to focus more on the effectiveness of the work. And effectiveness really implies a lasting impact. And effectiveness, as you know now, is the fourth element in our quality of research for development framework. So the previous speakers have already demonstrated how QoR4D can be used to strengthen research quality of an institution. I argue here that it's equally suitable as a foundation for good leadership and improved governance, which ultimately improves the effectiveness of an organization. But for that to work, it requires a different approach to performance management standards, which with a much clearer, stronger focus on trust and empowerment. And I just want to outline why that is the case. And it might be useful to go back to a challenge statement that Benton and Bailey put out there in 2019. And I want to use that challenge statement in order to address the question, what style of leadership is really best suited to address systems challenges? And the challenge statement was that agricultural productivity promotes food system inefficiency. And I quote from that paper where it says, a focus on increasing agricultural yields and efficiency decreases the effectiveness of the food system through incentivizing externalization of costs. Instead, focus on the efficiency of the food system to deliver profits, health, diets, and a healthy planet. So reframing the productivity argument towards efficiency of the food system provides a clear route to reducing market failure, improving public health and sustainability. And I think this is really a core challenge that all of the research for development organizations face. Reframing the productivity argument towards the efficiency of food systems. How can we actually do that? And that really poses two questions. The first one is the leadership style and the culture of our research for development organization really fit for purpose? And the second one is, can these organizations effectively address this challenge and reframe the research question that really demands an answer? For this reframing to occur, there are a few essential elements. One of them is that the scientists working within those systems need to acknowledge that their individual disciplinary contributions to problem solving will at the best be partial. And that's often very hard for scientists to acknowledge, that they don't have all the answer, that they need to work in a team, that they need to work with others in order to address those bigger systems issues. And often excellent component research, when implemented without the appropriate consideration for the broader system outcome, will actually degrade the overall system's performance. And that's that challenge statement that I talked about earlier. On the other hand, Walker and Macau argued that for good system science to have real impact at the political level, at the policy level, politicians will have to accept that fuzzy answers might be the best expression of expertise, while scientists have to learn that the identification of the fuzzy borderline between knowledge and ignorance may be a sign of real competence. So it's that mutual respect for the fact that nobody has all the answers, but they're all trying to solve the same questions. So rethinking complex interconnected systems is not enough. we also need to change how we govern them. So if scientists want systems to perform better, they need to be comfortable with making a partial contribution. No discipline can solve these problems alone. On the other hand, if institutional leaders and funders of that research want to improve systems performance, they need to incentivize a culture of collaboration by providing staff with a framework that enables what I call goal-guided autonomy. And this is a dangerous concept for many, because organizational leaders must implement risk management approaches that are based on complexity reading of situations rather than an analytical reading of isolated problems. And this requires staff with not only high-level technical and scientific expertise, but also with organizational competencies. While most organizations focus on the development of technical competencies, organizational competencies are often overlooked. Now, good governance and leadership is something that we are all responsible for. And that's a bit of a sideline that I'm taking here, because we all play a role in living the values that we espouse. We are the ones who set the standards. We determine the culture. And we need to adhere to these core values, such as respect, trust, and humility. We are all leaders, and this change process actually starts with self-leadership. So managing the inputs or governing the outcomes, this is really the question when it comes to leadership. And in most organizations, we see a tendency, strong tendency, to managing the inputs, to micromanage the inputs, and to be very concerned about giving anybody autonomy over making decisions about resources, and even small amount of resources. And being overly prescriptive when designing a transformative systems agenda is actually a recipe for failure and antithetical to transformation. An alternative starting position to managing the inputs is to govern the outcomes. And that brings me to adaptive management, because taking adaptive management seriously and embedding it deep into the culture of an organization will be absolutely essential if you want to have good governance of the outcomes. And adaptive management really starts with reducing the trust deficit. Once organizational competencies exist, once we have developed those competencies within the staff, those people need to be able to exercise their new skills. And this can be extremely challenging because it does challenge existing power dynamics. So exercising organizational competencies requires a degree of autonomy. So once those skills have been built, there's an expectation that they can actually be deployed. But empowering staff in making decisions that are consummated with their competencies means letting go of a command and control model of organizational management. And organizations might find this difficult given the trust deficit that they themselves have created by the old command and control model. So how can we overcome that? I would suggest that we could build a risk management framework that provides goal-guided autonomy throughout the organization. And this will foster much needed organizational resilience, whereby individuals adapt themselves by acting in accordance with the organizational goals and values. So that provides the context for that adaptation to take place. Then adaptive management will then consist of proactive measures reflecting on situational awareness rather than on reactive adjustments. And this does require an understanding of and commitment to the organizational strategy by everybody. So when I talk about goal-guided autonomy, it means the goal guidance is an adherence to, an acceptance of, and an understanding of the strategy of the organization. Now, you can't force people to accept those strategies, but if there is an ongoing conflict and people disagree with those strategies, then a solution needs to be found, because otherwise there will never be a constructive relationship between that employer and the organization that they're working for. Leadership and the governance, or the people responsible for the governance of an organization also should consider what's called multirational management. And a couple of years ago, the ISDC actually recommended in one of our review documents that the principles of multirational management and governance recognize that different sectors of our societies view the world very differently and use very different language and tools to articulate their perspectives. And clearly articulated respect for those different worldviews is necessary if the intent is to engage these groups via a continuous strategy. So just a few final reflections on that. Technical innovations on their own can unintentionally degrade systems performance. However, they can also act as entry points to catalyze systems changes via a social learning process. And that social learning process are these organizational competencies that I talked about earlier, and applying those in a way that actually contributes to the overall goals. We must then shift our preferences for traditional technical perspectives towards a knowledge sharing approach that facilitates goal-guided autonomy. Institutions need to provide the enabling environment that encourages scientists to achieve their potential and transgress the unhelpful technical and organizational boundaries that exist. The 4 elements of the Quality of Research for Development framework provide the foundations in which such an enabling environment can be built, and that is the conversation that we want to have with you tonight. So I want to finish with a call to action. For funders, organizational leaders, and for research managers, I urge you to use a broad, comprehensive QoR4D framework throughout the organization. I urge you to shift the focus from micromanaging inputs to governing the outcomes. Promote goal-guided autonomy for all staff at their appropriate level of competency. Empower people and align the organizational aspirations with action, so walk the walk. Scientists are encouraged to embrace an inclusive, innovative approach to ensure impact of the research. And I also urge scientists to acknowledge that science only ever makes a partial contribution, but that is actually a sign of real competency. And to everybody who is involved in this process, I want you to consider how disciplinary humility can improve collaboration, by understanding that we actually need others, and design and manage knowledge by recognizing that different communities have different entry points, different needs, and different rationalities. Thank you.
Thank you
Just
very
try-
much, Roger. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. Mpumi, maybe you want to open the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pierre, and thank you so much for all the support that you've given us from the Independent Advisory and Evaluation Services. Let me first thank our presenters for a very insightful and informative session where we got to understand and they've unpacked the quality of research for development framework and how it can be used effectively, in order to evaluate the research, and also looking at the inputs, the outputs, the outcomes, but most importantly, as Holger has indicated, the delivery of sustainable and long-lasting solutions. So thank you so much for that. Now we'll move on. We are right on time with the next 30 minutes where we'll engage deeply, and this session will be opened up by Mark Schutz, who will really take us through some of the examples, the practicality of all of this work from his experience over the years. So over to you, Mark, and really to thank all the participants for the questions. Please do keep on, engaging with us over the Q&A, and we'll have an opportunity after this to answer some of those questions with the panel of experts. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for attending the session. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, wherever you are. So I will try to speak not too long, a little bit from my experience over the past 2 years in supporting the new CGIAR initiatives, 32 of them, in embedding some of these novel QoR4D elements into their proposals and now operationalizing it. So I will speak to the 4 elements and try to give you some practical examples of what are some of the tensions institutionalizing QoR4D can trigger, and whether that's a bad thing or not. So for legitimacy, what we have seen, I think, is that if you really genuinely want to engage end users and demand partners in shaping a research and innovation agenda, it's very likely that you will end up with mismatches between what the research organization wants to supply and what the users actually demand. And those tensions are good. They need to be embraced and they need to be overcome. But this requires time, and we've seen that time is not always there. So that's one thing on legitimacy. On scientific credibility, Jill already referred to the scaling readiness approach as being one of the novel elements that's now being mainstreamed in the CGIAR. And scaling readiness supports evidence-based tracking of innovation along an impact pathway. So all the way from brilliant idea up to something that's proven to work and used at scale. And using evidence-based approaches and in innovation decision-making and innovation portfolio management, it may sometimes reveal that innovations where we have been investing in for years may not actually become more ready for scaling. So what do we do with these when we have that kind of evidence? Do we then stop investing in these innovations? What does that mean for scientists and partnerships, who've been investing on this for maybe 5 years? Just to illustrate like that, there can be some personal implications or partnership implications when we really start taking evidence more seriously and at the core of our decision making. For effectiveness, I think here, like Holger already said, like the dominant majority of the innovations is still technological, but we know that technologies on their own will not create outcomes and impact. They need to be packaged or bundled. They need to be combined with changes in how the market works, policy changes, capacity changes, and etc. So there, both internal and external synergies and partnerships are essential. And these partnerships need to be based on true co-investment and joint objectives. And again, this can come with transaction costs, coordination costs, but it's essential to achieve impact. So on relevance, and comparative advantage of any organization. It may imply that you will find out that maybe other organizations are faster, better, and cheaper in doing what you are also doing. So what does that mean? How do you redirect investment in, let's say, along a research, innovation, and scaling pipeline? Should we do the scaling? No, we should not. We should work together with organizations that are set up to actually deliver at scale. Should we do the blue sky research, or should we leave that to universities and participate, of course, in it, but maybe not invest too much? So I think this kind of asking yourself these kinds of questions is part of the QoR4D platform or framework, and it may trigger some changes in the way you organize yourself, you position yourself, and the identity of your organization. So I think institutionalizing QoR4D will and should create tensions in the organizational modus operandi and stimulate businesses as unusual. So, and this goes hand in hand with organizational culture change and culture growth, which applies both to internal audiences, for example, scientists, managers, but also to external stakeholders such as partners and funders. They also need time to familiarize themselves, like, hey, what is this organizational restructure? What does it mean when an organization like CGIAR fully adopts QoR4D? So this change management implies that all organizational, internal and external stakeholders develop a more realistic idea of how impact actually happens, moving away from over-promising towards more realistic ideas that, you know, starting off from a brilliant idea all the way up to impact takes 10 to 15 years on average. And how do we support that? How do we incentivize this? How do we make sure there's no perverse incentives for making shortcuts that eventually do not lead to the desired outcomes and impacts? So to sum up, institutionalizing QoR4D will create tensions, but it's for a good cause, like Holger also mentioned. So these tensions need to be embraced and managed as part of a broader change management process, and this should involve internal and external organizational stakeholders. So with that, I hope I kickstarted some discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark, for these opening remarks for our discussion this afternoon. And I realize there's quite a number of questions that have been posed in the Q&A box, and we really thank you for that. And I see that there's also some answers that are provided by the speakers. So having said that, and with those introductory remarks, perhaps I will kick off with some of the questions, and then I'll open it up to some of the participants to also, you know, engage on the discussion. And some of the comments that have been also provided on the Q&A box, Pierre will help us with those. So perhaps just the first question to Jill, as you really helped us just to put the framework to set the scene. Looking at step 6 of the evaluation using the QoR4D framework, perhaps if you can further explain how do you triangulate between quantitative and qualitative results? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Humpi. Yes, as I said, triangulation supports high quality science-specific conclusions. How does it do this? Well, an example would be you're using different methods of data gathering and analysis, quantitative and qualitative methods. For the quantitative methods, you'd be looking at such things as the outputs, numbers of outputs, etc. And for the qualitative, you would be looking at how certain aspects of these, like, for example, capacity development. You could look at whether or not the capacity that was built was relevant to what needed to be done, whether or not there were incentives for that capacity development to occur. And then you would draw it together under the sort of the triangulating system to see if there was agreement in the information that you were getting. If there was no agreement, then, well, if there was limited agreement, then you would need to go back and have a look again at what was happening. This would help to give you the evidence to be able to make reasonable recommendations, and then to make credible and reasonable recommendations. So it's important to look at all sources of evidence and to bring them together in a rounded picture.
Well, thank you very much, Jill. I'll now hand over to Pierre just to take us through some of the questions that have been posed by the participants. And then, of course, our speakers will then help to engage on those and respond. Thank you.
May I ask Marlene Schutter to ask a question live? She was referring to partnership, and I think she can ask live the question. So she's postdoctoral fellow at Worldfish. Thank you, Marlene.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for a great presentation and a really useful overview of the QoR4D. Yes, so I think my question follows kind of on what Mark was saying about partnerships, especially my second question about the volatility of partnerships that was briefly mentioned by Andrew. It seemed like that would be sort of a burden or a difficulty in doing evaluation, that sort of volatility. But I wonder if it's also worth including it in the evaluation, sort of the extent to which partnerships are volatile, and also following with what Mark was saying about sort of embracing those tensions between goals that might be identified by the organization versus goals that resource users might have, and how that could play a role in evaluation. And the other question I had was more of a question to Jill, when it was about the who of evaluation, sort of who is sort of the beneficiary of evaluation. I was wondering if the partners in partnerships, so farmers or resource users, are also intended beneficiaries of evaluation, or even play a role in evaluation, because I would assume that they are quite well placed to evaluate both the process of the project and the outcomes, especially on legitimacy and effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps in terms of answering the questions, Andrew will help, and then Mark, and then at the end, Jill with the last part of the question. Thank you, in that order.
Thank you, Bumi, and thanks for the question, Marlene. Yeah, so on the partnerships, and I'll go a bit broader than the volatility side of things, that yes, it should be part of the evaluation, but it's also, I think, part of understanding the partnership process as you go into the design side of things. I won't touch on the farmers as beneficiaries, but if we're really serious about having deep partnerships, it's not just about getting together as you put the proposal together and hoping that the partnerships will work. Many of them won't work, and that's indicated in some of the evaluations, but you can address some of that by proactively investing in those partnerships through, and it can be partnership brokering, and we've used that in the context of engaging with researchers, engaging with the private sector, investing quite a bit in partnership brokering, so you better understand each other's values and drivers, so that you don't end up with sort of ships passing in the night in terms of partnerships. You've got to invest in that and to bring everyone on board. And I think if you can do that, you can minimize some of that volatility in partnerships. And here I'm talking in partnerships in the context of other research partners that might be universities, private sectors who you might be using as scaling partners, or with NARs. So that's my response to that one around volatility, is really putting a lot more effort into investing in partnership brokering. And maybe Jill might want to cover on on the beneficiary side and the valuation side.
Mm-hmm. Should I go next?
Yeah, go ahead, Jill. I can follow up on you. No worries.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I think I can answer this best by providing an example. In more recent years, the understanding of the value of participatory approaches in the development of improved varieties in the CG has been very important, and particularly with respect to gender. There's been a great deal of consultation with women farmers in recent years in terms of the type of characteristics that they would like in a particular variety. And this has actually been successfully built into the breeding programs. So, I mean, as it's reasonably recent, we still have to see how effective that has been. But in terms of design, and also scientific credibility and legitimacy, certainly those issues have been very well addressed. And if I can make a slight plug, on the Outlook on Agriculture has recently put together a collection of papers that that specifically look at this issue, and they're available as a virtual special issue. They're freely available, and they are on the Outlook on Agriculture website under collections. So a lot of these papers are from CG Research, and if you'd like to see in more detail what has been done in terms of involvement of farmers, then I think that's a good collection to look at.
Yeah, let me just build on that a little bit and also try to give an example. So I think in terms of partnership, what is very important is that partnerships are fit for purpose, so that we are very explicit about why do we partner with this specific public organization, private organization, research organization. And I think something that I know has changed compared to a previous portfolio cycle is that, you know, CGIAR initiatives are actually asked, like, is this a demand partner? So is this a partner expressing a certain demand for a solution, or the partner have a specific challenge that they want CGIAR to work on with them? Is this an innovation partner? So is this really a partner that helps us to design, test, and validate the innovation? Or is this a scaling partner? So is this a partner that we want to work with because we believe that they can take the innovations as part of their own systems and approaches to the end user, whether those are farmers or extension officers. So I think that's a first step of, you know, being much more explicit about, like, what type of partners we work with and why. And then maybe a second element is that, you know, equality in partnerships. And I always have a very good example here from Rwanda, where CGIAR is working together with 1 Acre Fund, which is quite a large private extension service deliverer. And we really work on the basis of co-investment. So you don't pay us, we don't pay you, but we work on a joint agenda. And what I've learned from that, from developing that joint agenda, is that it's very hard, because initially, if you ask them, like, what are your research questions, you know, where can we help you with? It's not that they have a list in the back pocket to say, like, oh yeah, 1, 2, 3, and then everything will be okay. So it's really a process of sitting, trying to understand each other's systems, each other's incentives, mechanisms, each other's timelines, and organizational mandates. And then coming at some point, you will end up in the middle and say, like, wow, if we could solve this challenge for you, that would really be cool. But what is nice is, if you work on a basis of co-investment, is that you really get down to the things that have high relevance for your partner organization. It's a very different dynamic from coming to a partner, putting a bag of money on the table and saying, like, so what shall we be working on together? If they need to invest their own resources and they need to clear that inside, and they need to be able to explain that to their CEO and managers, then of course they want to work on something that supports them in achieving their organizational goals and mandates. So I think, like, in partnership, there's a lot of improvement that we can still make. But my experience is that you know, this basis of co-investment, which does not always have to be like in cash, it can also be in kind, but that's a very healthy way of starting new partnerships. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark, for that. And I realize that there's some other questions. I think perhaps Vanda, you'd like to come through as well and ask a few questions that I've seen on the chat. Thank you. Please, if you can introduce yourself, the organization that you represent, that will be helpful. Thanks.
Hello, I'll just first of all check. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Yep. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for asking me to ask a question. First of all, thank you very much each for some really diverse and interesting perspectives on these issues. My name is Vanda Morgan. I've had the privilege to work recently on many different forms of assessment of both the NARs and the CGs through points like BPAT, the Breeding Programme Assessment Tool run by the University of Queensland, funded by Gates, also through some research work that was done by CAS, looking at the breeding programme effectiveness. One of the things that I would like to say, Holger, you've already responded to a point I made. I fully agree. One of the biggest challenges is that of effective performance management, and then actually breaking that down into at an individual level, and that can be within the research teams, but it can also be within the partnerships. It can also be with the extension programs. How the inputs of those individuals contribute to what's happening, it's not clear. There is a lack of clarity about what the objectives are, and as you've alluded to recently there, Mark, you know, what it is about the understanding of each other's systems and mandates and creating joint agendas and therefore joint objectives and goals. When you have so many different vested interests, political, and also in many of these countries, people who do want the money, who need the money in order to be able to facilitate the research. And linking into something else that was said, when the research donor funding is often very short term, 4 years, in relation to trying to achieve something that, as you've said, a change may take 10, 15 years. So I think my key question is how can you bring together and engage and incentivize so many of these different vested interests in a one CG approach to the research, but in also trying to ensure that you have an effective starting base for analyzing and reviewing and evaluating how effective these programs are. So complicated, but I will simplify it. How can you really realistically bring all of these different vested interests together? Because they are not one organization, they are many organizations with different mandates.
Yeah, thanks, Vanda. I think I'll hand over to Holger and Mark with some of the practical examples. Thank you, being on the ground.
I mean, that's really the perpetual question. How can you bring all those different agendas together under one umbrella? And the answer to that is you can't, because inevitably there will be groups that do not agree. And if you can't reach at least the base level of value consensus, then you are in a no-win situation. So that's why I was arguing for processes such as multi-rational management, where you really try to see the issues from all different perspectives that the stakeholders have. But ultimately, that needs to lead to a base level of value consensus. So unless you can agree on a goal, you cannot work together on a solution. If the goals are too far apart, sometimes the only option you have is to acknowledge that there is no consensus. You cannot force it. but there are lots of good tools and good mechanisms that can help and facilitate a platform that can come together. And that needs to be tried, and needs to be tried over longer periods, and needs to be tried many times. But you cannot do it by force. And acknowledging sometimes that something does not work because the positions are simply too far apart is often the safest and the most honest way of moving forward, because otherwise you're wasting resources and you're probably damaging people and relationships in the process.
Yeah, I can maybe build on that. Thanks, Holger. And thanks, Hannah, for asking that, huge question, the elephant in the room, like how to make it happen. And I think, like, what immediately came to my mind is the iceberg, right? The iceberg, you see the tip of the iceberg above the water, and 80% of the iceberg is actually underwater. We can't see it, but we know it's there. And so I think my answer would be that you need to approach it from a change management perspective. And like we did this, we went through a change management process for scaling readiness, as I said and Jill said, like it's one of the novel elements of the CGIAR performance and results management system. And we asked ourselves the question, like, what are the implications for different groups of people in the organizations? Like, what is some of the resistance? Why do people resist it? Try to understand, get into their shoes, and then also try to think about, like, and how can it help people? So I think what you need to do is focus on the different levels of the iceberg. So not run away from trying to create systemic change in terms of routines, in terms of the organizational culture. How do we think about impact? How do we think about partnerships, and etc. But then also translate that into, okay, what are some of the incentive mechanisms that we currently have for assessing the performance of individual scientists in the system, assessing what we consider to be a good partnership, assessing what we consider to be quality research, but then also trying to go above the water or the sea level and start working in small pockets in the organization where people actually do believe in changing some of the practices, and trying to have champions and supporters in different levels of the organization and start talking positive about this new way of doing things. Generate some success stories that you can then highlight, and you basically try to get along the people that were initially a little bit skeptical by showing, like, hey, do you actually want to be part of this different way of thinking about what quality research for development actually is, and what CGIAR can be, rather than being stuck in what it is currently, and that it will be impossible to change. So I think that iceberg really resonates well with any kind of systemic or system change. That you don't go only for the systemic change, because you will fail. There will be so much pushback, but do it gradually. Try to think about incentive mechanisms, create positive energy, supporters and champions in different levels of the organization, and work with where there is energy to do things differently. I think that's my experience. Thanks.
No, thanks, Mark. And let's move on in the interest of time. I see we've got 6 minutes left. Perhaps I'll request Stefan to come through, just a short introduction, as well as the organization that you're representing. Thank you, and then the question.
Thank you, Nompumelo. My name is Stefan Kacheris-Mattes. I'm the head of program for the Fund for International Agricultural Research at GIZ, and I listened with a lot of interest to presentations that I've just heard. And as you mentioned, the CG system is undergoing a fundamental change, and we need to deal with complexity. So I would like to limit my question now to one that supports one that has been asked by Alexi Prades also, which is also on my mind, and that is, we are in the moment also looking at the possibility to have scientific and innovation advisory panels also to the science groups. And would you, from your perspective, see that that is eventually an option also to improve quality of science for development? Because the framework conditions and the situations that we look at currently obviously seems to change much faster than we can design initiatives and responses to it. And I think we would need to look at how can we respond to changes that impact on effectiveness, on relevance, on efficiency, on participation. So I would like to hear a view from those who have been presenting also how they would see how those different parties can get engaged in an interactive format also to make those things that you mentioned happen. And would you think that those scientific and innovation advisory panels could eventually be a topic to address it or a forum to address it? Thanks.
Thanks, Stefan. Perhaps Holger can assist with the response as our chair from ISDC. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. What I can give you is a personal perspective rather than an ISDC perspective, because we actually haven't discussed it at ISDC level. But I think it's a very important issue that needs to be resolved. Because clearly the ISDC is not the body that can provide that sort of function, given that our mandate is to really advise the System Council on particularly scientific matters, and that could easily lead to real or perceived conflict of interests. So there needs to be some sort of mechanism in place by which that can provide it, that advice can be provided. But it needs to be done in such a way that it's not in complete isolation of what the ISDC is doing, because same as with the issues around multi-rationality, we all aim for the same goal. We all want the organization to be successful. So there needs to be good communication between those different bodies that provide relevant scientific advice, but without blurring the boundaries too much. Where exactly these need to be drawn, I think that is something that needs to be discussed with all of the stakeholders, but it is a very important issue to be resolved. In terms of agility, I agree with you. I mean, we're living in an environment where the external environment is now changing so rapidly that every organization and every government around the globe is struggling with keeping up and having the necessary agility. But that means that having a really close look and laser sharp focus on getting the leadership and the governance right is very important, because what we cannot afford in that sort of environment is something that is overburdened by bureaucracy and takes an awful long time for any sort of decisions to be made. That's why I argue that any effective organization actually pushes the decision-making as far down into the organization as it is possible based on the capabilities that they have, so that the leaders of that organization are not bound up in making trivial decisions when they really need to make critically important decisions about the future direction. And I don't think that there are too many organizations that actually get that balance right at the moment. And that's probably worthwhile for us to reflect on.
Yeah, thank you, Olga. And we are right on time. It's already 3:30, just some concluding remarks from my side. Really to thank all for your participation. It has been a great engagement this afternoon, and to really thank our presenters for the excellent presentations, as well as the information, sharing your wealth of knowledge in this subject. But most importantly, the organizers, those who are working behind the scenes, we really thank you for all the support being led by Pierre. as well as the FAO to, for giving us this platform to really share about, this important topic. So thank you so much once more for your great participation and really for engaging with us robustly on this. And we hope that this discussion has been really helpful to help all of us in terms of enhancing the quality of our research for greater impact. Thank you so much. I think we'll end it at that. And we really thank you. Please do engage on their website. There are quite a number of events that we're planning. The most important one, as indicated, is the one that will take place in Brisbane this November. So thank you from myself and also from the ISDC. Thank you and have a good day further, or good night and good morning. Thank you.